Thank you very much for that introduction. So I'd also just wanted to say thank you to Rachel and for Julie, who was sort of the organiser that invited me along today to share my tips for functional capacity assessment. So I'm not an expert in ME myself, but I am very interested in learning more and doing what I can to pass on that new awareness that I'm developing to other occupational therapists who may not understand ME. So while I'll be doing the majority of the talking today, this is very much a team effort, this presentation. So you'll hear from Julie shortly for a few minutes, but I also wanted to thank Chelsea Bartlett as well for her contribution in the background. I know she's very happy to answer any questions that may come through following this presentation. So yes, our topic is functional capacity assessments and ME, what an occupational therapist needs to know. So the presentation will be mostly targeted towards occupational therapists, but if you're a person living with ME watching, you may be able to pass on some of this information to your own OT the next time they're completing an FCA for you. And if you do have any questions as we go, feel free to add them to the chat and we'll be able to answer them at the end for you. So a bit of a run through of what we'll be covering today. So firstly, Julie will give you a bit of an introduction to ME with a focus on the occupational impacts, which is really the first thing you need to understand as an OT if you're going to attempt an FCA. I'll say FCA throughout instead of functional capacity assessment, but that's what I'm referring to. And I'll explain what that is shortly. Then we'll dive into an introduction to FCAs, so what they are, when we do them, why we do them. And then we'll go through a bit of a step-by-step process for completing an FCA and describe some specific strategies or approaches that you can use when you're working with somebody with ME. And then we'll start with what you should be considering and doing prior to completing your initial assessment. We'll discuss how you can modify maybe your standard FCA information gathering approach so that it's appropriate to accommodate the function and symptoms of someone with ME. We'll briefly touch on some of the key tips for FCA report writing, but that really is a whole webinar on its own, talking about NDIS report writing. And then we'll discuss what happens after you've submitted the FCA, because unfortunately you're not done yet. Often there's a bit of follow-up needed. And we'll also just share some recommended resources for you at the end. So I'll hand over to Julie. Julie, just let me know when you want me to flick slides for you.
Great, thanks very much, Claire. So I'm just going to do a few slides here. So, and I want to recommend any occupational therapists watching this to have a look at some of the earlier presentations, in particular Nicole's presentation, Nicole Rudenko, because she has gone into a lot more depth in terms of what people with ME experience. So I've just put up here some of the key points, but as an occupational therapist, you need to remember that ME has multiple impacts across the person, their environment, and also what they're able to do. So these are some of the key aspects here in terms of the physical symptoms that people experience. And in other presentations, people have talked about PEN-A or PEM. Essentially, that's the crash that people experience. So they, it's not in keeping with the level of activity that people have engaged in. So it might be something additional that the person's engaged in. It might be a phone call, potentially. And then there is a crash because of the physical and the cognitive energy that's been exerted. And then people may take 24 hours, they may take longer, they may take days or weeks to recover from an activity that they've engaged in, even if it's something they very much want to do. So people will often plan for these. So it might be something like, you know, a celebration like Christmas. People will know that they're going to crash afterwards. So they'll kind of try to prepare, but they cannot avoid the inevitable crash. The other one is POTS. So this is where people may become dizzy, lightheaded, may experience fainting as a result of the change in their blood pressure when they actually go from lying down or sitting to standing up. So these are some of the key ones to be aware of. But just to say, there are a whole range of others, including sensory sensitivities. So a whole range of things which can end up looking like quite a very strange range of experiences that people have, but they do. The other ones are cognitive. So this is often referred to as brain fog. So people may have difficulties with word finding and difficulty with undertaking tasks which previously were quite easy for them, and including things like work and so on. Then there's the normal psychological consequences of having an enduring health condition and then becoming confined to bed and home, and with no effective treatment. So this is a very normal consequence. And then there's the social impact in terms of people experiencing isolation, compassion fatigue, loss of formal supports. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide, Claire. This was some work that Chelsea and I did with one of our colleagues, Laura Miller. This is where we were looking at how does ME, and this was ME-CFS, how does this impact on the person as an occupational therapist sees the person? So if you look at the diagram there, you can see that the person is experiencing those symptoms, as I've mentioned on the previous slide. Then what is happening is that as occupational therapists, we talk about occupation. So things like self-care, looking after yourself. We talk about productivity, like work and so on, either paid, unpaid, and then leisure. So things you do for fun. So essentially what happens with people as the level of disability goes up is that people actually start losing their ability to engage in those meaningful and valued occupations. So essentially, leisure goes first because that's kind of almost a bit of a luxury. Then productivity, so people end up not being able to work or do tasks which still have a lot of meaning for them, volunteering and so on. And then down to those activities of daily living, just the things we need to do to maintain, our house, our garden, all those sorts of things, as well as paying the bills, those sorts of things, take up a lot of cognitive energy, then down to self-care. So often what we find is that people get to that point that actually even having a shower, washing their hair, toileting and so on can become very difficult because of the energy expenditure. So essentially this is the pattern that we see for people, is that they will lose their ability to engage in those occupations right down until it's like survival and self-care. So that's that funnel there. And the arrows pointing in show how the environment starts to shrink for people. So over time, people lose roles, they lose access to being able to go out and do the things they want to do when they want to do them, involvement in their community, going out into their work, those roles that are really important to them. So they start to lose their ability to participate in their own lives, and the things that give their life a quality start to be lost. So we have this shrinking of their environment around them, and there's not enough to actually help with that. So in terms of supportive relationships, there can be relationships informal, like friendships and family and marriages, can be put under a huge amount of stress. So that can be really difficult. And that's where the compassion fatigue comes in, is that either through misunderstanding or pressures, that relationships can actually break down. And this hasn't been helped by the stigma surrounding ME, that people didn't understand what was actually going on for the person, and there was disbelief at some point in time. So relationships have been put under pressure, and we have had a hostile environment in terms of healthcare, and even in the general public, misunderstanding what ME was and what CFS was, and how that actually impacted on people. And we don't have those formal supports in terms of health and disability supports, and people have to fight for those, and they're actively losing their financial supports through the loss of work roles, and perhaps the loss of relationships and families where there may have been a bit more support. So we'll go on to the next one. And I think this is my last one. So on top of all that, or kind of intertwined with all that, there are other issues that people experience. So people often have difficulty getting a diagnosis, again, because of the hostile healthcare environment, so that lack of understanding, the stigma, and finding people, healthcare professionals who are actually skilled and understand how to diagnose. So I remember at one point, and I'm sure someone will correct me, but it was taking about an average of 7 years for people to get a diagnosis. So I'm hoping that that has changed and improved, but for many people, it has taken a very long time to get an accurate diagnosis for what they were experiencing. As we know, there's a lack of understanding and there's a lack of specific services in Australia. In fact, there's pretty much nothing. There's all the controversy, which was talked about, Joe talked about in an earlier presentation. And we know that these cognitive behavioral therapy and graded exercise therapy have been put forward as the gold standard of treatment in the past. That is not the case now, and those have been disputed very actively, and certainly graded exercise therapy, it has been taken out of the UK NICE guidelines, which are seen as being, informative for the UK, still in the Australian guidelines, but that needs to change. So please don't be thinking that those are appropriate treatments. They've been found to be harmful to people. Then, as I've already mentioned, the experience of neglect and stigma from health services, the very people that people are reaching out to get some support, to get some understanding of what's going on, which is why they have to become the experts. Nicole talked about a role reversal. People have to educate themselves and educate each other to actually do battle, unfortunately, with healthcare professionals when they're trying to get support and understanding and a diagnosis. I've already mentioned compassion fatigue, and then difficulty in accessing the NDIS. And this is where you can come in, and then I'll hand back to Claire.
Thanks for that, Julie. Okay, the fun begins. NDIS. Anything NDIS is always such a lovely, happy discussion, I'm sure. So let's just get started and we'll see how we go. So basically, we'll start with what, when, and why of FCA. So what are they? Why do we do them? So basically, this is my definition. It's not an official one, but I say that they're a comprehensive assessment of the person's functional ability across a range of daily activities and environments to determine the supports needed to assist them to achieve their goals. And when it comes to building NDIS plans or accepting someone to become an NDIS participant, very much they're sort of the key document that NDIS staff members will look for when it comes to identifying what somebody's functional level is and what supports are reasonable and necessary based on their level of function. So basically, what are they? It's quite a comprehensive assessment process normally. So it could involve document review, so looking over previous reports or letters, interviewing the clients or their family members, non-standardized assessments, which is lots of observations, and we'll go into each of these things in a little bit more detail. Standardized assessments as well. Very long report. A standard FCA could be 20 pages long. And also follow up afterwards, because unfortunately at the moment when we submit anything to the NDIS, it's very rare that it's ticked off without any further questions or follow up from us. So it involves lots of one-on-one with the client, sort of gathering information from them, but we also will engage with their informal supports. And if they are an NDIS participant already and having maybe a follow-up FCA, then there's formal supports or carers, like paid support workers, that we may be able to involve in the information gathering as well. In general, for a standard FCA, so this isn't an NDIA thing, probably 10 to 15 hours is on average what most OTs would take to do a comprehensive functional capacity assessment. And there can be a little bit of difference depending on whether it's an FCA for NDIS access or whether it's an FCA for somebody with ME who's already an NDIS participant. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail in the subsequent slides. When it comes to the NDIS, my brain needs flowcharts because there's nothing straightforward and simple about the NDIS. This flowchart is one I put together for completing an FCA. It's not an official one put out by the NDIA or by OT Australia or anything like that. So you're welcome to disagree if it doesn't work for you. But basically, I split the process into 3 different phases. And in this presentation as well, I'm going to pull out the follow-up part, which is normally included in that last phase, just as a separate one, because it's needing a bit of extra work at the moment. So if you're new to completing FCAs, there's lots of resources on my website, and even on my YouTube channel, I spend about 5 minutes talking through this. So I won't go through it all now in terms of what it is, because we're going to go into each of some of the key phases in a little bit more detail now. So we're going to start with the preparation for the FCA. So there's actually lots of preparation you can do before you just turn up for that initial assessment with the client. So some OTs may get a referral, it's booked in their diary, they kind of look at it 10 minutes before they're on the road and they're out. If you've got an FCA to do with someone with ME, you cannot take that approach. It's not going to work well for anybody. So that's why we wanted to spend a bit of time talking through the preparation plus why you need to prepare, which you'll see when we get to the information gathering side of things. In terms of getting the medical evidence right, so I'm going to talk about this in terms of, this is more crucial, I suppose, if you're trying to become an NDIS participant for those access requests. And on the next slide, we'll talk about that a little bit more specifically. But sometimes a part of any FCA as well is the medical evidence. And basically it's not our role as an OT to come up with that. If the NDIA planner is looking for evidence of the person's medical condition, and what they're looking for is that the condition itself is actually permanent, that the functional impairments associated with it are permanent, and that all the reasonable treatments available to that person have been trialled. So they won't go to an OT FCA to get that evidence and tick the boxes. They will go to some sort of medical officer specialist report. But we just want to make sure that in our FCA that we're aware that evidence is available and how it's been written, so that we're consistent in our reports and not clouding any sort of judgment that the NDIA planner may have. So that's sort of the main thing just to be aware of. And I suppose if you're an occupational therapist assisting someone to become an NDIS participant, that access request, it's always worth asking what their medical evidence is and having a look yourself, because if you're quite familiar with NDIS eligibility terminology, if the medical evidence has been written by somebody that isn't quite familiar with NDIS, you may be able to pick things up that can be maybe tweaked, flagged or whatever before an access request actually gets put in, if you can see straight away a gap that the NDIA might pick on. So we'll talk about eligibility for those access requests on the next slide. But in terms of just preparing for your FCA as well, you really need to have a clear idea of the purpose of the FCA. When it comes to access requests, what we're looking for is gathering evidence of substantially reduced functional capacity in one of the 6 NDIS domains. So I'm going to talk about that separately on the next slide, because I'll bring up those domains for you and talk you through it. If you're doing an FCA for somebody who is already an NDIS participant, even then there's different reasons that we might have in mind when we're doing an FCA. So it could be just for a standard plan review meeting. So they've had NDIS plans, they've got a new one coming up, and we want to make sure that they've got the right supports added into it. So for those sorts of reports, sometimes it's actually that they've had some previous OT input, and there's been some beneficial changes. Maybe we've prescribed some AT that's helped reduce risk or build some sort of independence or managing symptoms better to improve overall function. It's good for us to actually capture some of those improvements, so that if there's an ongoing need for OT, that we've got some of that evidence in our FCA. Sometimes FCAs are for a change of circumstance. So that's usually accompanied by another letter, another form that says something has changed and that what you had previously built into this person's plan is no longer working. So if that's the reason that we're doing the FCA, we need to be really clear on what has changed and provide that evidence of this was the situation before, this is what the situation is now, and this is why their support needs are different. And sometimes it's that we get the referral for an FCA because just the support needs, there hasn't really been a change, but maybe they were never funded correctly, they're insufficient. So we want to be really clear with specifics about what support needs are needed. If it's extra support worker hours, what hours are needed, why, what are the risks if they're not provided. And then the final part of preparing for the FCA, which is probably the main thing that might be a bit different if you're an OT that's used to maybe doing minimal preparation before you go out to do an FCA because you do them every day. You really need to understand the client's individual experience of ME. So it's coming down to things like what their communication preferences are. So for some people, it could be that they prefer speaking via telehealth appointments, could be face-to-face. It could be actually they prefer written communication, so communicating via email as much as possible rather than those face-to-face interactions. Also finding out if they have support people that they would like involved in the assessment process and to what extent. And some people may choose to actually delegate a whole lot of that information gathering to their support person as one of those strategies for conserving their energy and pacing themselves. The assessment timing is really important and really comes down to OTs understanding that to make our service accessible to people with ME, we might need to be a little bit more flexible. So you've heard all through the presentations already, it's not just, oh yeah, they get fatigued. It's a completely different experience. It's a neurological exhaustion that they don't have control of. We can't sort of just expect them to suck it up and we're available now. That's the only time we can do it. It's not going to work that way. So we just need to find out, do they have a particular time of their week in their day where they feel most able to complete, and if we do having that face-to-face component where they can come along and participate in that to the best of their ability. And also keeping in mind that you probably can't offer them a last-minute appointment. We've had a cancellation, would you like to do this assessment tomorrow? As we've heard, often it's planning for appointments days, weeks in advance so that they know they've got time afterwards and spacing for if they do have that crash from the result of engaging in our assessment process. And just the final thing to be aware of as well is we don't want to get into the, even a phone call can cause that crash. So we don't want to think, oh, we'll just give them a quick 10-minute call and maybe ask them a few questions. No, it doesn't work that way. So you've got to be very targeted in what you're doing, but trying to find out what their key symptoms are that you might need to be aware of before you go out. So just as an example, we'll talk about some of these more in information gathering. But as Julie said, sensory sensitivities can be quite significant. So something even like if you're someone that likes to wear really strong perfume, you need to find out whether there's any sort of sensory sensitivities like that before you go out. Because if you turn up smelling like your best perfume, or you've been on 2 other visits and you smell like a dog and you smell like maybe cigarette smoke or something like that, you're actually like your assessment will be ended before you even get in the door. So finding out what are those things you might need to be aware of, if particularly for those face-to-face appointments and for planning the rest of your assessment. So before we get onto the information gathering process, just a little bit more on that meeting the NDIS eligibility. So I mentioned basically to become an NDIS participant, if we're doing an FCA, our focus really needs to be on, do they have substantially reduced functional capacity in at least one of these NDIS domains? So these are the domains you can just Google NDIS eligibility, functional domains, this will come up. But there's the link there as well as where we've pulled this from. So that communicating, these are the 6 domains. To be eligible, you don't have to have reduced functional capacity in every single one. It's just one. But I suppose people with severe ME are probably going to tick the boxes for being reduced, probably across all of these. So we just want to, what I have found is most helpful. And for some OTs, they might do an abbreviated FCA. Main reason being that if you're not already an NDIS participant, you're self-funding. There's not really any government funding to get an assessment done until you're an NDIS participant. So OTs are trying to keep the costs down by doing what is the key thing that NDIS needs to know to get them onto the scheme. And it's basically addressing these subheadings. So if we can use those, then that's really helpful. So those subheadings are things like communicating. So speaking with people, written language, how other people understand you as well. Socializing, so could be keeping friends, interacting with the community, and also things like behavior or emotional regulation feeds into that as well. Learning, so from the OT point of view, often we'll use the term cognition. So it's not just learning to do new things, but memory, attention, executive functioning. Mobility is pretty straightforward, so walking, transfers, but also being able to leave your home. So we know for people with severe ME, that could be something that you really should specifically comment on in that domain. Self-care, obvious things, personal care, grooming, hygiene, eating, drinking. Probably, again, all of those things, there'll be enough detail that we can comment on each of those separately. And then self-management is like those IADLs, household management, managing your finances work as well if people are still doing some of that. The key thing to keep in mind is, unfortunately, the NDIS doesn't care if these activities take longer, if they're painful, if they're difficult. All they really care about is if you require the assistance from another person or the assistance from specialised AT. And that's not just a walking stick or maybe a shower chair that you can get from the chemist, something that's a bit more specialised that someone needs to prescribe for you. That's what they judge as being substantially reduced functional capacity. So if you're the OT writing this, sometimes all you can write is difficult, pain, slow, but really try and change your language to, do they need assistance? Is there specialised AT? Or can they not do it at all because of their functional difficulty? Because they're the key words that the NDIA will be looking for to grant that access. Okay, we'll go on to the information gathering process now. So if you remember those phases I had in my flowchart, we're on to the next one. So when we've done that preparation, we're hopefully going to accommodate symptoms as best as possible. What are the key things we're doing? So first of all, there's interviews. So some of the key things to think about. Basically, we need to focus on capturing their worst day. So we don't want to hear the stoic story of, oh, but sometimes I can do this, and oh, it's not that bad, or there's people that are worse. We've really got to sell what is the difficulty here and really capture that first day to be able to meet that criteria, like I was just saying. So if you're someone that powers through and like it's difficult, but I just do it, may not necessarily be helpful for the information we need to tell the NDIS. So tell us when there's days when you need assistance. Also thinking about, standard approach for an OT FCA could be a 2-hour face-to-face home visit is sort of our initial visit where we assess the home, we do lots of interview questions, maybe some standardized assessments. That's not going to work for somebody with ME, so you need to know that going in and try to plan for how can you split your assessment. Generally, there are ways that we can do it via telehealth, but if it is at all possible to do even a short face-to-face visit where we can do part of the home assessment as well, do some of the observations, and then do standardized assessments or other interview questions later on. It's really important to try and find a way to get that in there. But as part of that interview, thinking about what questions you need to ask. So you might, if you do FCAs all the time, switch onto autopilot, go through your little checklist or your form of the questions that you typically ask. You really need to stop and think, do I need to ask this question for this person? Focusing on, is it actually highly relevant to the support needs that I'll be requesting for them? Because if it's not, you're basically just getting them to expend energy without really having any value. You're just sort of that autopilot. So really try and think about and go through your initial assessment form before you even go out there, cross it off if you don't think it's a standard one that you need to ask. Think about, can I get it from, a previous report? Someone's already asked what that was. Maybe I can, instead of asking it and getting them to tell the story from scratch, I can recount, this is what I understand. Is this right? Anything else to add to try and, minimize what they need to be able to do. Slowing the pace as well. So as we heard, that brain fog is a real thing. So we need to give them space to think, to process the question that we've asked, and also to respond. So if they say one thing, don't think, yep, done. Okay, next question. Give them time to think, is there anything else I'd like to add before you move on to the next question? Including caregivers. So there's research evidence as well written by involving people with lived experience of ME that have said a good strategy is to delegate some of that, talking about their experiences to the caregivers in their life, their family members. So asking, obviously don't assume that that's the case. Always ask the person with ME if they have that preference or that they'd like you to involve a caregiver, and to what extent, and try and facilitate that. And finally, it's very probably not typical for us to do our interviews via maybe like a written format, but for some people that could actually work better. So are there some straightforward questions that rather than you asking it, getting their response, you could maybe write it up in an email, and they can answer those questions in written format in the time that they've got when they're feeling able to do that. The next one is observation. So this is probably particularly tricky for people with ME. And unfortunately, they are hard work, but they are essential. So every day now, OT reports are coming out saying that they're being knocked back if they base their recommendations too much on what people have reported in an interview. And that's not necessarily just the person reporting, but their family or support workers as well. We really need to base our recommendations on our observations, but there's a few ways that we can do it. But just keep in mind, if we are just basing it all on things people have reported to us, it's also not really clear to us whether any supports we might recommend, like a particular piece of AT, is actually going to be the best option because we haven't seen it ourselves how they're attempting to do an activity. Sometimes it's changing a technique or educating a caregiver versus the typical AT item we might normally prescribe. So in terms of observations, to try and space it out, you don't need to, even for people without ME, we don't observe every single activity the person does in their day. We don't have funding for that. So we need to be strategic and try to plan so that we've seen a few different variety of activities across the different NDIS functional domains. So when you come to writing it up, you've got some of that objective observational evidence that you can put into each domain. But really try to focus on, if you know that there's something you're going to be asking for support for, then that's where you want to have the evidence of, okay, how are they doing it now? I've seen how they're doing it now. And that's why I'm saying they need this support or they need this AT. A lot of the time it will be in the home environment. So a lot of people with severe ME are either housebound or bedbound. So it may be that if your typical approach is to include some community-based assessments, it may not actually be applicable for your particular client. Consider the timing. So this is where that preparation can be really helpful. So if sometimes it might be that the person knows that at a certain time in the day, that's when they would normally do a transfer. That's when they normally would try and eat something. It may be that they can multitask and do that while you're there, or you are sort of, that happens towards the end of your assessment or before you even start engaging with them. Can be quite tricky, but if there is any way that you can see something while you're there without it becoming an extra demand for them, then that's helpful. If that can't be done, then using videos. So if there's a caregiver, take a video of next time they do a transfer, take a video of next time they try and eat something, again, so that we can say that we've observed that. And keeping logs is helpful as well. So using vague terms like they needed help a few times at night or they transfer only a few times a day, it's very vague to the NDIA. If we can give as much specificity as possible, then that really strengthens our evidence. So it could be capturing, how far could they actually walk before they needed to sit and have a rest that time when they wanted to go to the bathroom. It could be how long were they able to feed themselves for before they needed somebody to take over. And frequency, yeah. So how many times did they actually wake up overnight? How many times per day are they actually able to physically transfer out of their bed? So those sorts of details can be really important. And if there's a caregiver that can keep a bit of a log, then that's really helpful for us. And finally, for the information gathering is the standardized assessments. So basically, there's no right or wrong. Some OTs will do a report without any standardized assessments, but the fact is that NDIA like numbers. So if we can choose some that are actually going to really add value to the report and that we know the NDIA will be looking for, then they're a good idea to include. But for people with severe ME, we don't want to go nuts thinking, let's do 6, that sounds good, let's put in lots, particularly if we're basing them on, or we're choosing ones where it's based on their self-report, because that's, again, extra work for them. If there's ones where we're rating as a clinician based on all the information we've gathered, sometimes we can add a bit more because it's not an extra demand for the person. But basically, if we're choosing an assessment, we need to make sure that it's focusing on functional impacts, not the symptoms themselves. So again, NDIA doesn't really care about the severity of symptoms. They want to know, does it stop somebody's function? Does it stop them from participating in something? So any assessment that you're choosing really needs to have that participation or at least functional level of evidence. The NDIS does have preferred assessments for different conditions. You can just Google NDIS preferred assessment tools and it comes up under their eligibility for different conditions. As expected, there's no preferred ones for ME, but one that they like for everybody is the HUDAS 2.0. So you can see it on the top of my list there. In terms of the others, I'll run through those, but just adding to that, sort of what I've already touched on is in terms of the psychometric. So just keeping in mind, whatever you choose, is there any reason why you shouldn't be using it for somebody with ME? So thinking about some of the symptoms in the presentation, and that clinical utility really is important. So if it's something that, oh, this is brilliant, it's, it gives us so much detail, but it takes them 1 hour to fill in, is that actually, worth it? Is it going to give the effort, the value that you're looking for, or is there a shorter version that will give almost as much? That's going to be more manageable for somebody to do. So my recommendations are HUDAS 2.0. even if you hate the tool, there's lots of people they're not a fan of it because it does have some limitations. The NDIA love it. And if you don't include it, chances are they'll do it by stealth with the person in a planning meeting where they just ask a few questions. And then a few minutes in, they're like, hang on, these sound like the who'd ask questions. And then they may not actually get the accurate picture that they should have. So worth doing. In terms of an overall general functional type tool, the modified Bartel index, that's a free one. You don't need to go through training. There's an online calculator version as well, or the functional independence measure. They do overlap, so I wouldn't do both, but I'd choose one of those. Same with the Lawton's IADL scale or the Community Integration Questionnaire Revised. They overlap a little bit, but their focus more is on that IADL, household tasks, and even things like social interaction for the Community Integration Questionnaire. Care and Needs Scale is actually a tool that was developed for use with people with traumatic brain injury. And it looks at basically, I love it because it assigns a number and then that it correlates to how many support hours are recommended. So even though it hasn't been validated for people with any condition really other than TBI, the NDIA often request it if somebody's requiring daily support needs. So have a think about whether, sort of have a look at it if you're not familiar with it. Does this look like it will be capturing the type of evidence in a somewhat accurate way? And then maybe think about whether it's worth including, but maybe with a bit of a disclaimer that they're, interpret with caution because it hasn't been validated with the MA community. And we can do some symptom-based measures. So I've used the term neurological exhaustion there rather than typical fatigue, but basically if you try and find an outcome measure for that, you'll get fatigue scales. And it's just, there's not really any, we did have a look, we make sure we weren't missing anything. There's not really any specific ones that we would say would be the gold standard. So again, it's just thinking about, is there one that's going to add value? I know Chelsea uses the BFI as a bit of a short measure. The brief fatigue inventory just as something to include, but again, just thinking, will it add value? Same with, does the person have lots of cognitive impairments or sensory impairments which impact their function and that you're going to be requesting lots of supports for? It might be worth adding that. Report writing tips. So again, like I said, I've actually got a whole 3-hour course on NDIS report writing. So this is one slide, but some of the key things, language is really important. And unfortunately, it does need to be quite deficit focused. So if we really try and go in strength focus, they can do this still. Yes, this is difficult, but this is what they can do. It's not going to work in their favor for getting supports or for getting access. So unfortunately, we do have to take that deficit focus. But as the OT, that doesn't mean you need to be deficit focused in every other aspect of your interaction with the person. So prepare them for the fact that the report's going to be quite, a hard read. It's not meant to be sunshine and rainbows or anything like that, but tell them why you need to write it that way and find ways outside of your report to reinforce that strength-based approach. There's also NDIA terminology we need to consider. So if you're recommending capacity building type supports, sometimes we'll recommend other supports like physiotherapy or something like that. Don't use the term rehab. They see that as, something can be fixed. This is rehabable. No, it's not. So we use the term capacity building. And plain language is just keeping in mind that the people reading your reports from the NDIA often have no health or disability training. So I think you're writing basically for your accountant. If they can't understand the terminology in there, you need to include an example or a definition. It's not writing for another health professional. Formatting is very important. So there's lots of OTs will think, we write these FCAs, no one reads them at all, but we also want to do our best to make them enticing to at least skim read. And if you're presenting like slabs of text, that's not enticing for anyone to skim read. So some strategies you can use are clear subheadings, using dot points instead of long, chunks of text, and footnotes can be really important. So sometimes, particularly for this condition, we do need to add in some evidence about this is what the guidelines suggest, or this is what this condition actually means. Rather than put that in the body of our report, we can add it to the footnotes so that it's actually, still in there, but not making the report look like a hard read. The executive summary is, because of the fact that our FCAs are often 20 pages long, putting a summary on the first page where we say, this is the person, this is their key functional issues, these are the key things we'll be recommending, sort of in a half-page, one-page summary at the start, means that if they are going to read only chunks or sections of our report, if they can see that first and we can give them this is the person in a nutshell, hopefully anything else they do skim read later in the report will make a bit more sense to them. The content is important, so focusing on highlighting any risks to the carer or to the person themselves, any risks where if they're already an NDIS participant, we're not providing support could cost the NDIA more money in the future through like an injury to a carer or an informal support. And backing yourself with evidence. So that's where having all those specific details from logs of distances, timeframes, frequencies, referring to some research evidence as well can be really helpful. And then finally, before you sort of submit the report, don't write it and just submit. Always go back to the person themselves or their carer and double check your facts. So you want to make sure that you've interpreted everything they've provided, because like I say, often the information gathering process is different to the way you might normally do it. So make sure that you've got that information correct before submitting. On the home straight, now you've submitted your FCA. Unfortunately, you're not done yet. So something to keep in mind at the moment, and it's not just particular to people with severe ME, the NDIA are rejecting a lot of applications that OTs put in, or there's significant delays in getting them read and actioned. So prepare yourself, if you're the client or the person with ME, or if you're the OT, prepare your client that there could be some delays. If it's for an access type request, for someone with severe ME, I haven't heard of anyone getting on first go. It's sort of one of those things where, unfortunately, they seem to reject and, say try again and see who's actually got it in them to keep fighting. So prepare sort of for that rejection, but be prepared to know that it's kind of like a two-stage thing. So if they do reject, make sure you request the reasons for it, and in writing, because you want to know for an access request, are they rejecting based on the medical evidence, like the permanency of the condition or the treatments haven't been trialed? Unfortunately, they still think that GET, CBT are things that have to be ticked off before you can say you've tried everything to meet the NDIA criteria. So you want to know, is it medical evidence or is it the functional impact? Because if it's just the medical evidence, there's no point rewriting your FCA. It might be they've already accepted that there's enough evidence there. It's the medical things they're questioning. Try again, specifically addressing any reasons for rejection that they gave. If you're an OT that's new to this, maybe your first one gets back, don't sort of think, that's it, can't do it, so we have to go see someone else. Maybe seek some supervision or an outside opinion. Sometimes just having somebody else read your report, even before you submit it, for that doesn't know the client, can pick some gaps that just aren't obvious to you anymore because you know the person so well. And just keep in mind that there is hope. There are people with severe ME on the NDIS, so we can get there, but unfortunately it's not really a smooth sailing process a lot of the time. Few references that we mentioned in the presentation there, and just some other OT specific resources. So hopefully all that I just threw at you in a few slides, we're going to turn into a PDF that's some of those key considerations for the different stages. So we'll work on that. We'll make sure we get some feedback from Rachel as well to try and make that as user-friendly as possible, and then hopefully get that out to everyone soon. Lots of general resources on my website. So this is just general FCA. There's nothing specific to ME necessarily for the FCA resources, but there's courses. The one ME CFS specific one is I did run a journal club session earlier this year where we discussed one of the articles that was on that reference list there, and specific to how it applies to the OT role. It's worth a look. We've got a couple other articles as well that Julie's been involved with through more research projects that you can have a look at those. And a few websites as well. So we've got ME Group Australia also has some resources there that I'd suggest people look out for, and check out their YouTube channel. This presentation will be there along with others that Julie mentioned as well that are worth looking at. There's also Emerge Australia, the ME Association, which is UK based, and the NICE guidelines are from the UK as well, which there are a few things. So if you see anything about GET, CBT, as Julie said, hasn't quite caught up and been updated yet, but most of the rest is still applicable. And ME International as well has lots of resources for health professionals. That is all. Thank you for surviving a whole chat on NDIA functional capacity assessments. If you're still with me, happy for anyone to ask questions now, but also you can send them through afterwards if you're watching the recording. My email and Julie's, and I say if there's something we think Chelsea is better to answer, we can send them to her as well.
That's great. Thanks, Claire.
Can I just mention something, Justin, just quickly? Molly put a comment in the chat about a functional assessment. So I have just put the link to that in the chat. So that's a recent paper, 2023 assessing functional capacity in ME CFS, a patient-informed questionnaire. So that's something that's new to us. So I've just downloaded that. So thank you, Molly. So yeah, just another one out there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I especially like in the presentation the how to navigate the NDIS, because that is and I thought your information, Claire, was really on point with that, and I think it, especially the flowchart you showed on the functional assessment of FCA, like that was really good to show and understand the complexity of it, but trying to simplify it at the same time, and that being the basis of the NDIS. So yeah, no, it's really good.
That's why, unfortunately, they take so long. And I noticed that Rachel's commented that often you might need even more hours. So then it's just weighing up who's funding that. If they're an NDIS participant, often there might be some funding there we can use. If they're not, it's trying to work out, how can we do this as efficiently as possible, but still capture what we need to capture so that we're not wasting our time applying in the first place. So I can just see, I was going to say Rachel's added in terms of the medical diagnosis, having the specialists involved, the right specialist is probably one way, because I think there was also a question about if it was rejected on permanency. Again, that all comes back to the doctor's information, really, anything medical related. So I have done some independent OT FCAs for people that are maybe going up against the AAT. So I've seen the types of questions that the lawyers will ask and what they're trying to pick holes in terms of reports. When it comes to anything related to the permanency or the treatments, they'll always go for an independent medical type opinion. So if you're the OT, don't think that there's necessarily anything that you've done wrong or that you can change in your report for that.
Yeah, that's cool. Open that up to any questions for Claire or Julie, or any questions just generally, I suppose. We're sort of at the end of our formal presentation. So, yeah.
So somebody has put in they got on first attempt with severe ME CFS. So congratulations to you. The right person read your report. So there, like I said, there is hope.
I might just ask a question if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
I think the hardest part about functional capacity assessments for this client group is that with the observation side of things, a lot of times people can do some tasks, but it's the impact of that on the rest of their day or week, or the crash that experience after you're gone. So it's really, I don't know, it's quite difficult, I guess, the observation side of things. I just wondered if you had any ideas about particular tasks that may be more beneficial to observe, or I say it's coming down to what sort of supports are you going to be asking for help with, I suppose, because they're the things that they're likely to reject and that you need the evidence for. And it's probably one thing that I didn't give enough attention to that I suppose I should have when it's that information gathering. When you come to writing it up as well, you really do need to focus on yes, they did it once, but then that meant the next 2 days they couldn't do X, Y, and Z. So sometimes it's even spelling out how much time was allocated for this one simple task meant that the next day they needed extra assistance with a different task, or that they couldn't do it at all. So thank you for bringing that, because that's a really important point to include. In terms of choosing the assessment, like I say, sometimes it's actually if they've got another person in the house that can just video things so that you're actually not having to be there in person observing them. Because that's, like I said, that timing is hard to get, and it's hard to justify going in and asking them to just show you something outside of their normal routine when they would have had energy saved or banked to be able to do that task normally, to avoid the crash. So there's also thinking about sometimes even just like simulation. So do you need to see the full aspect of the whole task, or can you just simulate and do parts of it? Or like for eating or something like that, in terms of like, do you need to see a whole meal, or can you just see how they hold cutlery for a part of that, if there's difficulty with that? So it's thinking outside the box in terms of what are you normally doing just for the sake of, because that's the easiest way that you normally capture information, and how can you do it a little bit more efficiently, and sometimes even without you needing to be there. So I don't know if that answered I don't think it answered your question at all, because like you said, there's no easy
way to do this, and it'll be very individual for the person. But finding out, even back at that, if you're doing like an access FCA for an access request, yes, we need to prove sort of that substantially reduced functional capacity. But another part of it as well is establishing what goals they might have if they were to become a participant. What sort of supports do they think they might need, and focusing our observations around those sorts of things in particular. So if they're wanting mostly just self-care type assistance, okay, that's where we focus our observations, and we just know that you're not attempting to cook meals or you're not attempting to do those. So we don't need to observe something related to that just for the sake of ticking a box. We can use our own clinical reasoning to say, based on what we observed with their self-care function, this is what they're reporting with their self-management tasks, and this would make sense that they just don't have the energy. It wasn't appropriate for us to do an observation because of the impact it would have, like you said, on sort of their energy for the subsequent days.
Thanks. And you said, Claire, that it's only one of the criteria, one of the 6 that is required. So I guess if that lines up with the person's goals, that's your priority, isn't it?
Yeah, and like I say, a lot of the time we can use our own clinical reasoning, our clinical expertise to make those assumptions that if they can't even, transfer easily, they're not going to be able to stand and cook at a stove. And that's, you can, as long as you sort of spell that out for the person that may not be able to connect those dots, you can say they weren't able to do this based on our observation, therefore we assume their clinical expertise or experience that they wouldn't be able to do this because it's even further demands on their, physical function, cognitive function, and it wasn't appropriate to complete an assessment or observation when you already have that background information. So a lot of the time it will be probably focused around those self-care tasks or mobility transfer tasks as the key things that we'll be looking at.
Yeah, and people could report to the OT the extent of the crash, couldn't they? After they'd, done those observations, that would be
and like I say, it could be those logs as well. So if there's a carer that like here's the week or whatever, and then they did this one activity, and then you can see they went from transferring 5 times a day to they transferred once, and then they got back to that 5 times. So that sort of routine can sort of be that more objective evidence, I suppose, of the impact of the crash. Or it could be that maybe not the frequency they were doing things, but then they went from, set up assistance with feeding, set up assistance, had a crash, and then those next 2 or 3 days, they were needing physical assistance. Sort of anything that can kind of graph it out, show it, rather than you trying to explain it in words as well. Tables, those sorts of things can sometimes be helpful.
Is there Rachel just had a question in the chat about sharing suggestions on how to find an OT that's knowledgeable in ME. How would you do that?
That one's tricky. That is tricky. And I know that we've had discussions with Rachel about that. There is a way to search for occupational therapists, but that's just occupational therapists generally through Occupational Therapy Australia, which is our national representing body. But in terms of finding an OT with ME knowledge, they're going to be rare. So it's more about finding a receptive OT who is willing to learn basically about ME, and then finding ways either for the person themselves, I know that's not fair, but for the person with ME to actually educate the OT, or as I say, we have a tiny growing network which is happening now, gaining momentum. So hopefully over time, and I think also to, provide education on, the MEGA website and so on about what OTs can do. Watching these sorts of presentations, I think, is going to go a long way to the OT actually understanding what's involved.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's not a nice search engine where you can find an OT that specializes in this. Sometimes it is word of mouth. So even within some of the consumer type Facebook groups, support groups, they may be able to say, I'm based in Sydney. Does anyone know an OT that was able to do a good report? And like I say, even most of the assessments is telehealth, and you're able to do other videos and share those with an OT that way, then that's an option to access people with specialties if you're not sort of in an area where there seems to be OTs. But yeah, sometimes that word of mouth is where you will find people until we can, like Julie said, build our network a little bit more and maybe have something available of a short list of OTs that really that understand this and specialize in it.
That's cool. I'm not sure if we've got any more questions coming through.
So there was a comment about the Visible app gives you some to download your data. So again, yeah, anything, if you're already storing information about your symptoms, your function already, definitely that would be super valuable to share with an OT so that they're not asking you to fill in a separate log or something like that. If there's things that you're already using for your own pacing type strategy, then yeah, that could be really helpful.
Yep. Any other questions? I don't think there is. I suppose I just wanted to add that it's been another great session with some great insight, and just having all the information coming together in one sort of session and seeing the different points of view from OT, from research. It is really, it shows that there's a body of knowledge that's getting developed out there. And I think the more that we can do to share that for the ME community, the more that people who are currently faced with ME, but also those future who get diagnosed have a better pathway. I think that's very important in terms of what everything that everyone's doing at the moment is not just about the people who are suffering now, but it's also about those who come along in the future and hopefully have a better experience in terms of support than what a lot of people have had to date in this area. So thanks everybody for your time today. We have recorded the session. It will be at some point shortly put out as well, so you can come back and review it. There's definitely ability if you contact Mega Group or Rachel. She's always out there helping as much as she can as well. But feel free to reach out. Obviously, the presenters, thanks for your time. And if you do have any other questions for the presenters on the day, if you can't reach them directly, feel free to throw them through Mega, and we will definitely reach out as well and help connect. So thanks everyone for the day. I don't know if there's any final words anyone else wants to add in for the day. Yeah, otherwise, keep on keeping on, and thanks for your time, everybody, and have a great weekend.